exactly. There were over 30 events, right? And they all went off they went off perfectly without a hitch. I mean, I've gone to conferences without keynote speakers showing up in 30 different events. It's amazing. And of course, the series has been views from the humanities, and it's not necessarily an intuitive perspective. When you think about the Anthropocene, you want to talk to scientists and see what they have to say and all. But what's been astonishing about the series, and it's really been edifying for me, because, on the one hand, we've had this incredible range of scholars coming in from all different fields. So we've had theorists, people like Catherine Yusoff, Tim Morton. From my end of things, eco-criticism, we've had Ursula Heiza, Jason Groves, we've had historians, people like Paul Edwards, Gabrielle Heck. And just think about this. I mean, all these different perspectives on the Anthropocene from different fields, entirely differently. We've had eco-theology from Ariel and Tucker, who showed her wonderful film, Journey to the Universe. Our own Dick Hedges, film and media studies, weighed in. Anthropology, we had Nicholas Kaw and our own Casey Walsh. And we've had scientists here too, most recently Pamela Ronald and Angelica Hilbeck. And it's just amazing that, each one of these fields, there's a feverish amount of activity now on the issue of climate change in the Anthropocene. And it was just incredible to see it happening. And not just from the perspective of, our side of things, of scholars, but rather too the perspective of people who actually are doing things, creating things, so those who can do, those who can't research. But so we've had great talks by journalists like Andy Revkin, Andy Warner, really fascinating thing. You wonder what you could do if you're interested in graphic novels and comics. There's an opportunity for climate journalists out there. Wang Shu, of course, which is amazing, from architecture, winner of the Pritzker Prize. We've had poets, we've had Alison Adele Hedge Cook, winner of the American Book Award. We actually had a panel of Anthropocene poets. Had a playwright here, Brian Granger, doing his new work, Eden Falls, and of course next week, John Luther Adams. But I mean, just such an incredibly diverse range. So, and that's not including the films that we screened also, right? So Watermark, Journey to the Universe, Raising Extinction, Emergence of Doubt, extraordinary range of things. So what we're going to be doing today is we're bringing back 6 scholars, and we're going to reflect on both the series and the talks that we've heard, and just more generally on the issue of the Anthropocene, coming at it from the perspective of the humanities. So I won't take much longer. I'll just introduce folks. David Lee, who's with the Earth Science Department. Next to him is Peter Alagona, History and Environmental Studies. Chris Walker from English. Jeff Hawley from Anthropology. E. Cook from English, and John Foran from Sociology. So, John, why don't we start with you, and everyone contribute a little, and we'll open up to a larger discussion afterwards.
Okay.
It's up to you, wherever you like.
I like to talk. Yes, thanks to the IAC, thanks to everybody involved with this amazing series. I was able to attend 9 of the events, including the wonderful 2-day conference, from which I take my title today, and I do have a title for a 5-minute talk, which I'd like to share with you. The Approach of the Anthropocene, a Scholar's Dream and Activist Nightmare. Has this series been powerful? Yes. Life-changing? Almost certainly, and I think for many people. 2 events had this kind of impact on me. Tim Morton, who gave the keynote at the conference, was one. Now, his was a name that I'd never heard of until it appeared on the announcements for the conference, and I spent much of the winter delving into his magically enchanting books and blog posts. And from him, I learned at the conference something of the arts of what he referred to as serious playfulness. Actually, I already knew those arts, but I'd never called it that. And he counseled us to approach how we do something about climate change with serious playfulness. And this was part of a larger process of discovery this year, and that is of the environmental humanities generally. And this has been a big deal for me. Ken Hilton, whose name I confess I'd also never heard till about a year ago, was quietly going about building the exciting new Environmental Humanities Center on this campus. And under the advice and guidance of Ken and Chris Walker, my Crossroads Climate Futures comrade, say that 4 times really fast, I started to read the literature of eco-criticism in the environmental humanities, including such figures as Ursula Eise and Rob Nixon, whose landmark 2011 book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, connects the environmental humanities with my other passion, climate justice. So one big takeaway is that social theory has much to offer as we navigate the Anthropocene more generally. And I also felt this kind of excitement during Richard Wydick's remarks on natural capital and while reading the work of Catherine Yusuf as well. All of this is a scholar's dream, an infinitely complex, entangled, and interdisciplinary set of daunting, intricate, and highly consequential problems, paradoxes, and puzzles, with no end in sight. This was barely on our common intellectual horizon 10 years ago, let alone when I started at UCSB a quarter century ago. And how did this come about? The approach of the Anthropocene itself is one answer. And what is my second big takeaway? If climate change indeed changes everything, as Naomi Klein argues, this means that the world we are headed for is one bearing many possible futures. The one I foresee is not Andy Revkin's Good Anthropocene, or the recently launched Eco-Modernist Manifesto, neither of which strike me as adequate to the task, since both leave the broad outlines of our present political and economic systems in place, only reformed to work as they were somehow meant to. On the other hand, I don't imagine the disaster foretold in Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes' clever cautionary tale of the Great Collapse of 2093, when the disintegration of the West Antarctica ice sheet leads to a complete reshuffling of the global order with no more than 1 billion human survivors. With other friends and scholar activists here at UCSB and far beyond, I've come to a rather different analysis. To cut emissions, we need to stop the fossil fuel industry in its tracks, and only a social movement of a sort hitherto never seen can actually do that. We are now engaged in a rearguard action, a kind of battle that is a retreat in the face of 2 superior foes called global warming and climate change. This is the activist nightmare. We will fight hard to preserve as much dignity as possible, to cede as little temperature rise as we can, while trying to square the circle on the social side by aiming for more democratic arrangements, an economy of solidarity and leveled wealth, and a less violent and more loving culture. This outcome is worth risking a lot for, and there are a growing number of people who are ready for it. I'm one of them. The most important thing, and the possible redemption of this nightmare into the dream we'd all like to realize, is the coming together of all of us, even though I know that we'll disagree in the many conversations to come, and I suspect very shortly. I'm happy that the great epic drama of our time is finally underway, and we will all have roles to play in it. This series has prepared us for the journey ahead. Let's choose wisely and love each other.
So what's interested me most about what's happened over the year in this amazing series on the Anthropocene is our collective exposure to projects that materialize the idea of the Anthropocene across a very rich range of media and methodologies. The word Anthropocene itself is unforgettable once you've heard it, but I'm not sure that its meaning is obvious. For many outside the academy, and in the academy, we do tend to celebrate, maybe even wallow in our jargons. For many outside the academy, maybe for many outside the environmental movement, the etymology of the Anthropocene may be off-putting, and Catherine Yusuf in her presentation called it an improper naming, while acknowledging that it's nonetheless crucial. It's a reference that is resonant for insiders, but possibly impenetrable for non-initiates. And this is emblematic of something that I think is an ongoing challenge for all of us. Meaning the kind of hybrid academic activist who I think is well represented in the room. The challenge is the translation of our critical terms and concepts, and I'm reminded here of a work by Frank Kermode from 1979 called The Genesis of Secrecy. I don't know if anyone in the room remembers this. It has this vivid image of the circumcised ear. And by the circumcised ear, Kermode is referring to a kind of elitism of insiders who write only to insiders and thereby forego what he calls the radiant interpretations that can come from outsiders. And this is why we benefited so much from the list of people that Ken gave us, the musicians and composers and visual artists and journalists and travel writers and playwrights and actors and filmmakers and creative writers and mixed media artist critics to kind of cross-pollinate our academic models of research and activism. I think we need their work to materialize the issues that we are passionate about, to crystallize them and kind of recondense them for us even as we take those same issues apart in our analyses. So I do admit that it's artificial in many cases to binarize in this way, another point Ken has already made, to separate making from analysis. The hybrid research practices, again, of many people in this room, turn the local county into a laboratory, right? To explore food networks or garbage issues. Scholar activists who make the material of our lives into what can happen in the classroom as well. So for me, the materialization benefits of the Anthropocene series have been central because materialization will ease this great difficulty that we have of spreading information about and acting against invisible environmental destruction, like the rise of CO2 parts per million, the slow forms of violence discussed by Rob Nixon. Locally, we could discuss a fundamental issue, and I intend a pun here that only within the last year has been taken up by the state of California, groundwater depletion. In last week's New Yorker article on the Colorado River, David Owen contrasts the visible evidence of reservoir shrinkage, so how many people have been over to Lake Conchuma lately? Bathtub ring. We all know what the bathtub ring looks like, and we see how much the reservoir has dropped. But we don't know how to quantify groundwater depletion, which goes along with the loss of water from the reservoir. So there is a NASA project called the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment Project, and you'll notice that that translates into the acronym GRACE, which uses 2 satellites to track minute fluctuations in land surface that can help us determine how much groundwater has been lost. So we knew to be frightened that Lake Mead is now 60% lower than it was in 1998. The NASA project shows that the Colorado River has lost in its watershed 50 cubic kilometers of groundwater, which is the equivalent of almost 2 Lake Meads. And we didn't even know to be frightened about that. So we have to learn how to materialize the invisible damage that will also affect us. So I would love it if part of our time today could include a discussion of successful and less successful forms of humanistic creativity and communication. So what visualization models have clicked for us since the environmental movement really began to take off? So if the hockey stick graph is your favorite moment, if McKibben's coinage EAARTH works for you, that would be great. These are examples of environmental rhetorical work that I think are particularly the province of the humanities. We need to keep in mind that as interpreters, we're becoming less and less patient about sitting still for explanations. We're more and more attracted to successful logos that communicate instantly. And as a kind of final point about materialization, I'd like to give a shout out to Shelby Miller, who is the IHC's graphic designer. She came up with this stunning posters for maybe all of the events in the series. She graphically materialized what was attractive and powerful about the talks that we're giving here, and I think she's really part of the team that brings us here today.
Oh, there you are.
Okay. All right. You'll hear now from a stodgy sort of Marxist perspective.
Closer, Jeff. Could you bring your mic up closer? You bring your mic to you. Thank you. Kiss the mic.
That's something. That's the theme from the series
right.
as well. Yeah.
That's right.
throughout this series, which I've enjoyed a great deal, it's been really enjoyable seeing a range of different speakers from a variety of different disciplines and occupations and just different walks of life talk about the topics related to what we're broadly understanding as the Anthropocene. It's been fascinating. And I've really held Ken's, I'm seeing two of these because it's so close. Can I
Say by vocal projection.
I've held Ken's question of should we welcome the Anthropocene from his inaugural lecture kind of throughout the series, because it really oriented the way that some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of how can we move forward to nature instead of looking back. So I come at this as from the perspective, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm interested in understanding why destructive environmental practices make sense. I study deforestation in the Amazon and attempt to really get at the core reasons that people are cutting the forest down, something that is considered to be a vital global resource. And it's by conducting research on the ground with these people, it's easy to see how population, economy, poverty, different factors play an important role in that, but it's not any one of those. But one thing that hasn't really been injected into that conversation in the Amazon is the importance of ideas, beliefs, and perceptions about what nature is and what appropriate forms of interaction with that environment are. So what this idea of nature as being a corrupting force, the forest, bugs, rot, disease are always kind of lurking, and they're controlled through work, and so thus work in the Amazon is really valued as something that's implemented in this broader project of bringing progress to the frontier and to this Stone Age sort of existence, which is how these modern sort of pioneers contrast themselves with those who live in the forest. They don't romanticize the indigenous people. They think they are either subhuman or of a different time period. And so, although we would never say these sorts of things here locally, I kind of try to bring that same idea of what is nature and how do we interact with it. And when I look around campus, for example, when I got here today, I was greeted by the blowing of the leaf blower, getting all the litter off of the path. To my left was, the guys who were trimming the jasmine bush. This nature control is a fundamental part of our society as well. And we're not deforesting. We don't consider what we do to be in that same realm. But I see it, if not being of the same impact, but being of the somewhat expressing the same fundamental ideals of nature, even if we are purported environmentalists. And so when I look out my window to get this view of nature, I ignore the spikes on my windowsill to keep the pigeons away. I look out and see the guy who trims the bamboo every week to keep it nice and straight and uniform next to the thunderdome. So this mentality for me is present, in our society as well, and it's not really I don't see it being as overcome. I think we've made some progress, but I think fundamentally addressing our perceptions of nature and how we should interact with it are still guiding the way that we judge ourselves and even our neighbors. For example, with my talk, I talked about how you think about people with messy yard or people who don't shave. Fundamentally, the ability to control nature continues to be valued socially. So thinking about Ken's question in the inaugural lecture, if we can't return to nature, then what is forward? What are the human-environment relations? What do they look like in our cultural imaginary? And I've been thinking, can I imagine a future in which we are interacting with the environment or with nature in a way that is less destructive? And the more that I've thought about it, I've come to the conclusion there are essentially two real strains of this, one in which we've mastered nature through engineering. It's increasingly inefficient. It looks kind of like a software commercial. Things are clean, they're angular, they're disciplined, interspersed with gardens and butterflies, charismatic megafauna, holograms. Everything, the nature that is there is how it's contained or artificial. It makes me think of Oliver Ryder talking about just the extent to which different species are managed, particularly the California condor. So are there no condors, and if so, just how much management goes into that, or have they, as John Wallen talked about, or are they in the realm of dolls, similar to the teddy bear, something that as it's becoming increasingly endangered or less of an actual threat in our lives, do they become valued? Is the future of Earth one of a decimated, sort of red-brown marble, coolly observed by civilized residents of a utopian spacecraft, that have left the Earth and are now kind of coldly observing the devastation? Is it this post-apocalyptic Mad Max scenario? And when I'm looking out the window, I'm not looking at the ocean, I'm looking at the Thunderdome, so I think about this Mad Max a lot. It's a nice brown, corrugated metal, lovely, and the guy trimming the bamboo. So is it a parched Earth with hard-scrabble band of survivors, warm for resources, the skyscrapers being pulled down by creepers, the wolves in the once busy streets, the Statue of Liberty sinking in the quicksand? It seems that even our visions of the future treat nature as something to be overcome in order to achieve this idea of modernity. Our full potential in this positivist narrative is that we continue to overcome, that nature is something to be overcome, or else it pulls us down. And so it's ironic to me in some ways that we find ourselves in this dilemma because of this, what I see as a mentality that is reinforced economically and ecologically through these relationships. But we continue to think that we will find a way to get our way out of this through technology and through progress. And some suggest that these binaries are dissolving. This is a very, within anthropology in particular, the nature-culture divide is something that seems to be increasingly out of favor, and nature and culture are kind of merging in many ways. But what I see in the Amazon, particularly when I apply that perspective here, that's not what I see. I see us talking about things in a different way, but interacting in a very similar way. And Latour and the eco-modernists and others kind of say we should embrace these new creations, these nature-culture hybrids, sort of the Frankensteins. These can be liberating. We can leave behind, we need to leave behind this nature-culture baggage, but it doesn't mean, as far as I can tell, that we're confronting this dichotomy of nature and culture. We're coming to grips with the economic components of that, in which consumption, in nature control, and these tendencies of inequalities and structures that will remain and will determine how resources are distributed with consumption of goods and services not being an import, pollution and misery not outsourced, and waste, following our Nicholas Kaywood's talk, is not something to be disposed of using a vast amount of resources, but really a word that goes out of favor, because what we consider waste, as he showed and as we've been seeing in other ways, is not waste. That's a classification we have for things that we don't want, but it's not necessarily universal. So even in our dystopias and our utopias, we can't really move beyond this divide. While there's much liberation in technology, it doesn't address or it's not a solution to the structural inequalities. So I think we have a long way to go, and in order to do that, we really need to confront this baggage of the back to nature ideal, because we can't take that with us if we're moving forward to nature.
So first, a huge thank you to the IUC, and especially to Emily and to Susan for just such a challenging year. It's been really incredible to think alongside all of you about this incredibly important topic. But looking back at the rich program for the year, I came to the realization that I'm still not exactly sure what the Anthropocene is. Is it primarily a geological marker? Is it a set of social diagnoses? Is it an analysis of a particular energy regime? And the reason why I say I don't know exactly what it is, it seems to me that the concept just demands so much of us. It demands that we think across scales that we're not accustomed to, both geographically and temporally. And we might start to think of the Anthropocene as instead a type of strategic bafflement, a bafflement that should provoke a pause before we embark on the hard task of living together on this planet in a completely different way. But throughout the year, two issues in particular have given me pause, and I wanted to share those with you. And the first is the relationship of the imagination to the planet, and the second is the issue of species thinking. First, as to the material environment and how it shapes or opens up our imagination of the personal and political possibilities, it's really stayed with me from the very beginning. As Catherine Yusoff so eloquently stated in her analysis of how geoforces imprint life, she stated, quote, "When plates break through tectonic arrest, thought takes notice," end quote. Perhaps by considering our city infrastructures, our technologies, as the future strata of the Earth, we might reground our imagination of what is possible and, more importantly, what is important for all of us in the present. The world's role in shaping our horizon of thought, however, isn't just confined to moments of rupture like the Lisbon earthquake that she so eloquently talked about, but it's also in those small, unexpected moments. So, for instance, Professor Hawley just gave a great summary of his talk, but his discussion of the connected practices of landscaping and manscaping reminded me that our desire to control nature is never isolated, and that the cultivation of the self and the environment always go hand in hand. This was also present in Nicholas Cowley's discussion of how modern septic practices have created the illusion that we are apart from and no longer dependent upon the ecologies that we are embedded in. The second issue is whether it's possible or even desirable to fathom ourselves as a species, that is Homo sapiens. Recalling Tim Morton's talk, Humankind, it seems to me that the provocation behind this thinking is the estrangement of our everyday activities. Activities such as buying gas to go to the store to buy milk might be considered as acts of autonomy. We would think about that as a type of consumer choice, perhaps. But Morton was pressing us to think about that instead as the expression of an agency that is primarily collective and therefore out of our control. It's no longer an expression of autonomy at all. While this reorientation seems helpful for thinking about the uncanny qualities of the Anthropocene, I'm still curious as to whether species thinking might actually hide other salient aspects of our environmental crises, such as the unequal distribution of harms across race, class, gender, and geography. Further, while Morton has claimed that, quote, the Anthropocene is the first fully anti-anthropocentric concept in history, end quote, I can't help but wonder whether species thinking is merely another assertion of human dominance over nature. This point was forcefully brought out to me in E. Cook's wonderful panel on natural capital, in which they were pressing us to think about whether or not the concept of ecosystem services is valuable. But it seems to me that that concept of services is really fraught with the hope of completely quantifying nature as having value only for our species. I do think, as an aside, in response to Professor Cook's kind of query about what sort of media help us to think about these issues, it is important to note that the concept of species thinking is not just one that's floating around the academy. If you've seen Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, one of the film's kind of moments of emotional climax takes place around the question of whether or not one can kind of disavow personal relationships and act selflessly for the species as a whole. So, I mean, it's gone blockbuster now. In the end, I personally think that the concept of species thinking is perhaps a sign of optimism embedded within the Anthropocene. Perhaps it's an optimism that we can approach both our environmental and our social problems simultaneously while ignoring neither. So these are the two issues that have captivated me the most. They've given me pause throughout the year, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as we finish wrapping up the panel. Thanks so much.
That was great, Chris. And Emily, can you hear me? Emily was the first one ever to complain to me a little while ago that I spoke too softly. So I'm going to try to speak a little bit more loudly. And the first thing I'm going to say is that this has been really an incredible year, and it's been a fantastic series. Everybody said that, but I want to say it again because it deserves being said as many times as you can possibly say it here. I have to admit that when we started out this year, I thought, oh gosh, Anthropocene, right? Here's a buzzword that we're going to try to structure a year's worth of events around, and I'm not sure where it's going to go. I know that Anthropocene seems to have replaced resilience as the buzzword of the day. That's what I was thinking a year ago. But I'm not sure where we're going to take it. I have to say that I'm incredibly really pleased and kind of awed by the diversity of the program that's been put on here, so thank you. I think that the best, I'll just say before I jump into what I want to say, I think the best line for me of the year was when I think Gabrielle Peck called the Anthropocene a charismatic mega concept. And I think that that is still true, even having heard here today. So having gone from thinking about the Anthropocene being a buzzword to something more like an existential crisis that kind of reaches into every aspect of who we are as physical beings and biological beings and psychological beings and social beings and political beings. It gets me thinking about our sort of place in the very biggest picture of all, our place in time, our place in the cosmos, and what this says about how we're still trying to wrestle with who we are, perhaps as a species. So, are we in the Anthropocene? Does it matter? Should we care about it? What should we do about it? These are all questions about our place in the universe and even questions about time itself. So I'll offer this thought. Sigmund Freud apparently used to love to tell a story about great revolutions in the history of scientific thought, and some of you have probably heard this before. So what Freud used to say was that the first great revolution was Copernicanism, which displaced humankind in our planet from the center of the universe. Right? The second great revolution was Darwinism, which said that humans weren't special, but relegated us to only one of many species in the biological diversity of the world. And then the third, according to Freud, was Freudianism itself, which exploded the myth of the rational mind. So some of you probably heard that story before. Now, many years later, Stephen Jay Gould added to this, decades later, and said that the fourth major revolution in the history of science, if you want to put it that way, is the discovery of deep time in the history of geology and the earth sciences. Deep time, a term coined by John McPhee, which gave us not only a sense of our smallness in the cosmos, but of our smallness in the history of time itself. So what do we make of the Anthropocene in this context? Well, on the one hand, the Anthropocene is this incredibly, no matter how you frame it, whether it goes back 10,000 years, whether it goes back 4,000 years, whether it goes back 250 years, whether it goes back only 50 or 60 years, is an incredibly small sliver of time in the history of time itself, right? 13 billion years for the universe plus 13.7, 4.5 for the Earth. That's a long time, and we are a very small speck in that great story. But on the other hand, the Anthropocene, it seems to me, by claiming that we humans are now a geologic agent, in some ways relegates us, right? Back to some other kind of status. It's a counterpoint in some ways to the cosmological and evolutionary, psychological, and geological revolutions that Freud and Gould talked about and discussed in their work. Whether or not this is a good thing, to go back to Ken's question from the very beginning of the year, I think depends on how you look at it. What's clear to me, and what I think that the events of this quarter have really demonstrated, is that we've really achieved a level of power on this planet that far exceeds our ability to control it, and that we're just beginning to wrap our minds around. But what's also clear is that this moment has brought forth a remarkable outpouring of creative thinking, and that's really the thing I've learned this year. And so perhaps when the archaeologists and geologists of tomorrow dig into the slag heap of our society, they'll see not only the garbage and the pollution and the shit and everything else we've talked about this year, right? But they'll also see that creativity.
Because my talk is somewhat of a counterpoint to my colleague John. But I stand also. Unintentional. First of all, I just want to thank again Susan and Emily and all the humanists for their warm embrace. I think I'm the one scientist who's here. I haven't always understood all the words you use, but I've really appreciated your welcoming spirit. And I've learned a lot from this series. It's been great. So uncharacteristically, I wrote out my talk. Scientists usually don't do this, but it seems like a more typical thing for humans. Two clear framings of the Anthropocene emerged in the events I attended. These framings also appear in broader environmental debates. The majority view, which is commonly associated with ecological activism, is that the Anthropocene is a time of unmitigated degradation of the environment that threatens the very basis of human survival. Often this degradation is portrayed as due to specific malevolent parties who are intent on extracting maximum financial benefit from the earth without regard to the cost of both the environment and human welfare. Unmitigated capitalism is typically seen as the biggest enabler of this degradation, with great benefits for a few and great losses for most others. Technology is viewed with suspicion because it's seen as what got us into trouble in the first place. The core idea of ecological activists is that the Earth has reached the limits of what it can bear. And only by stepping back to a simple, more agrarian lifestyle with fewer people can we restore the Earth to balance. The minority view holds to the possibility that one can create a good Anthropocene. This view heralds both human creativity and ingenuity, while also putting a premium on technological innovation. In this framing, the Anthropocene, as opposed to the Holocene, is recognized as the only era in which humans have thrived and have reached their full creative potential. Without the Anthropocene, we wouldn't have Mozart, or Caravaggio, Tolstoy, or the scientific method. The core idea of this view, which is termed eco-modernism, is that modern technologies can reduce human demands on the environment while maintaining and improving outcomes for humanity. Eco-modernism embraces technologies like nuclear power, GMOs, and even geoengineering as necessary solutions to expand human opportunity. This dichotomy of views played out nicely in the series. Speakers like Catherine Yusoff, Peter Barnes, Eric Conway, and Angelica Hillbeck proclaimed the majority view, with Conway perhaps the most extreme in describing a grim, fully degraded future world where 20 meters of sea level rise has erased the coastlines, and along with them much of what we as humans treasure, from Venice to the vitality of modern democracy. On the other hand, speakers like Andy Revkin, Matt Nisbet, and Pamela Ronald embrace both human creativity and the role of technology in providing best practice solutions. I want to particularly single out Matt Nisbet's brilliant talk because his study of how public intellectuals frame the climate change issue is a model for me of breaking down the disparate ways we view the Anthropocene. In fact, when I first read Matt's 2014 Wires paper, I felt a tremendous sense of relief in realizing that I could be both a climate hawk as well as someone who embraces the Anthropocene for its role in fostering love, culture, and art. This argument is also playing on social media. The recent Eco-Modernist Manifesto from the Breakthrough Institute has led to a lively series of exchanges on Twitter. Groups aligned with ecological activists pillory the manifesto, with Climate Progress proclaiming the manifesto as representing denier views and that to even read it was sacrilege. Others, like myself, welcome the manifesto for presenting a new and fresh outlook. As we look to the future and the enormity of the challenges before us, we need to consider which parts of these divergent views we can bring together to forge an optimal path forward that increases human opportunity while minimizing environmental degradation. We can all agree that this challenge is a super wicked problem with no single silver bullet. In that case, let's be generous with each other's views and keep an open mind about the best way forward. Thank you.
So in a minute, I do want to open up to questions from the audience too, but I had a range of questions I was jotting down along the way, but I think I'll start with anyone on the panel like to respond to David first? And John, I'm looking down here, but
Just points of agreement. I don't view technology with suspicion, although a few of my wilder comrades might. Nor do I think that we're going to have a simpler agrarian lifestyle with fewer people, although that has been implied as well. But we do agree on the importance of creativity, love, culture, and art, and generosity and keeping an open mind. And that's why David and I have such a good time whenever we get together.
The only response I'll make is that I was really struck that how our talks, we didn't consult with each other, but they were essentially like a Bach fugue. I mean, it was point, counterpoint. And I particularly liked your ending, John, that essentially said the same thing at the end, which I started.
What struck me about both of your talks, though, and I think, John, your phrase was a huge social movement that's necessary, as opposed to a technological fix. So instead of like some sort of CCS, carbon capture and sequestration being the answer, maybe that's going to help things and all, but at the end of the day, it is going to be, and it's kind of why it should be here, be from the humanities and social sciences, that it is going to be a social movement that is necessary to do this. And I was struck by how everyone else was still thinking about moving forward also, rather than some sort of knee-jerk reactionary catastrophizing.
But the other thing is an agreement on climate science. I think climate science underpins this movement, and I think none of us really understand how dire the situation is, because it turns out it's always more dire than people have thought, and rather quickly. And I'm no climate scientist, as people like to say in the U.S. government. And enormous respect for climate science, ultimate interdisciplinary endeavor. It's amazing. With all its faults, the IPCC is an amazing, amazing undertaking. But what I like is that I feel that this movement that calls for changing everything is based on an interpretation of climate science, which again we can debate, and we have debated. But that's interesting. I mean, this is a radical movement based on science.
I think it repeatedly, and I have to say I've been doing this for quite a few years too, but just 2 years ago I was actually visiting Princeton, and my office was across from Michael Oppenheim, who's one of the principal authors of the IPCC report. And the more I listened to the guy, the more I realized what all was involved, and things that we in the humanities really couldn't weigh in on, things like, which David Cleveland did wonderfully in the talk in the series, on something like how methane is going to be an issue and how our heat production is doing that. I mean, we would have no way of intervening there if it wasn't for science drawing attention to it. Or more recently, and it's especially important where we are at UCSB, the oceans. I mean, as both a carbon sink and as a temperature sink, and that's all been scientists there first drawing our attention to it. Other thoughts? So the other thing that Ian and John, you were kind of introducing, this idea, which kind of, I think people find grating at times, whether we're scholars or activists or both, So we like to say that we have a certain kind of distance and we sort of honor that and strive for it. Yet in this case, it seems like that's blurring repeatedly for a lot of people. I would add myself to the list. Thoughts on that, though? I mean, it really does seem to be, maybe it's just the enormity of the problem, but it's somehow different than other problems that we've taken on before, sort of in a cultural way in the humanities.
Sure, I think that's part of it. It's an unprecedented crisis, a perfect storm of crises. And we could have tremendous conversation about scholarship and activism and their relationship. And I think that should be the theme next year for the IPC.
Duly noted.
Questions from the audience, by the way? Anyone wants to jump in with something?
I found it extremely stimulating. One of the thoughts combines something Peter said with something he said. I think at the end, I don't have the exact quote, but you said basically the Anthropocene can mean that humanity's ability to change the planet transcends our ability to imagine what we can do and its consequences. That reminded me of something a relatively obscure German philosopher was anti-nuclear activist along with Robert Jung Anders. He sort of made the theme of his work the antiquatedness of humanity, that we can't imagine what we can do on the planet, and his thing with nuclear energy, both, especially bombs. And this ability to imagine is really what you are saying. We need humanists to help us visualize, and I thought, the first environmental movement with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring sort of catalyzed the movement, and at least in retrospect, we think that it pretty directly began something. I was thinking, what's the equivalent for climate change? you'd think Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth was the first thing that came to mind. But in retrospect, I'd almost say that it triggered more of the climate denial. It was just a boomerang effect that, oh, he's exaggerating, you know, this isn't true, this is a distorted picture, and that's what remains, even for me, who was very sympathetic to that portrayal. And so I wonder, is there anything that you see, you know, and as rich as all the presentations and the different aspects of the Anthropocene that we've seen, is there anything that any of you see that helps us to try to imagine the scope of what is going on? I mean, it really boggles the mind in some sense.
Can I give a negative example?
Sure.
Of a coinage that I think is an environmental rhetorical device that works against maybe the kind of scholar activism that we've been talking about. So you know, I referred to the hockey stick graph, which gave rise in turn to, as you said, all kinds of debates and denial movements, which then I think got sort of filed away under the heading Climate Gate, as though the dispute about, you know, climate change, climate justice, as though that were one more media pundit's soundbite, like all the other gates we've had, you know, since the 1960, you know, since Watergate, right? So we're enormously successful in coming up with these images that both open up issues, but that also shut them down. So that would be a negative example, it seems to me, of our power to coin these useful terms. Against that, my hope would be that we can, you know, the attempt to sort of reclaim that terrain can happen rhetorically, and it has to be an ongoing effort.
Did you want to jump into this? No. Okay. So thanks for the question, Harold. So I guess I would say that, you know, back in the time that Rachel Carson was writing and things that she was writing about were very, very different. I mean, there were particular issues. You know, she was writing about pesticides and the effect on wildlife and ecosystems and this sort of thing. And at the time, it seemed like, I think, these environmental problems were things that you could kind of target and fix, right? In kind of in isolation, if you just developed sound policies based on solid evidence that was often in the form of scientific evidence, right? And so there's a way in which that particular work and several others kind of around it could catalyze a movement focused on a specific set of issues, right? I think that what makes this different is that it's not something, it suddenly seems like it's everything, right? And you know, if you take Naomi Klein's word for it, for example, right, movements change everything. If you take that, then you have to say, okay, well, what is a movement that seems to need to address kind of everything, right? Do, and how does it get started? And so I think that this is a very different story. This is a different time. It's a different set of modes of communication have changed. We can all think of key images and key moments in this story. And I think we could kind of add those up to a set of maybe catalysts, right, that kind of have propelled this discussion to where it is now. But I think that it's proven much more difficult for us to wrap our minds around this issue, in part just because the issue is so difficult to wrap our minds around, right? It's a different time, it's a much bigger set of things, and it seems to somehow touch on every aspect of the way we live.
I don't know that I agree with you on that. I mean, the problems with air, water, and earth pollution that Rachel Carson was talking about were pretty much everything. And there was a lot of economy involved and...
Yeah, so I think that we've increasingly understood that to be true, but to read that back on the past is a little bit misleading. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
But if you look at our responses to it at the time, we have the Clean Water Act, we have the Clean Air Act, we have the Endangered Species Act, right? It seemed like these were issues that we could deal with through kind of technocratic means. And that's the way we had the political debates and we structured our policy around them. And so we can look back on that time and think, gosh, you know, if you don't have air, you have nothing, and water is related to biodiversity, and you know, you can start to talk about it in that way. But I think that reflects a little bit more of our view now, looking back on the past and decades ago.
Just wanted to comment that one of the responses of this university to the crisis, the environmental crisis, was to form the environmental studies program, which resisted capture and made sure that there was a broad approach. So that was a response, that's a fact, and that program has been maturing and going through its various interpretations of where we are and who we are. My question to you, can you imagine that the greatest tasks of the humanity might be to take on fully in battle gear the idea of consumerism? Seriously, I'm serious. The word needs to get out of the vocabulary. It's misleading. Nothing is consumed. We know that. It just changes form. And I know from my work as an activist and scholar, as an environmental lawyer over the years, that the term consumer was more or less created and applied in order to disempower citizens. To disempower. To say, well, wait a minute, we'll run things. You just do your job of consuming. That's what makes our economy go. Now, I mean, I really believe that we must take on this idea that people are consumers. People aren't consumers. They're producers, they're whatever, a billion things. But none of us, not one of us, should accept the label of consumer. Anyway, that's my question. Where does that fit with your work?
Well, it seemed like your initial talk, I was thinking back to the topic.
Well, it certainly actually goes to John's statement too. So Naomi Klein has actually argued that in a broad way, looking at especially globalization in the last 20 years and how things have upped that way. So the surprising thing is, since the era of environmentalism, we say the kickoff was in the early 1960s with like Rachel Carson and all, the amount of consumption that we're doing is just gone way up. So not Naomi Klein, but Elizabeth Klein had a book a few years ago called Overdressed that drew attention to the fact that every American consumes, buys 64 articles of clothing a year. And Naomi Klein has made the argument we really don't have to go back that far, pulling back on what we're using. Probably in 1970s levels, as she argues, that will probably hold us at, is that right, John? Am I remembering that? That will hold us at a 2-degree limit? Something like that.
But of course, it's all totally out of whack. The global economy is a machine that is producing this crisis. And related to the sort of phenomenon of consumerism, which we in the global north are basically the paragon of, we're going to have to accept, we somehow are going to have to accept the fact that, progress and well-being isn't based on economic growth, especially of GDP. And so we will have to consider how we're going to reduce consumption at the same time as we increase the quality of life for lots of other people besides ourselves. We will reduce our consumption. And we'll all live better and be happier, because a credible amount of this economy is spent on absolutely useless things, from advertising to militarism. There's tons of waste that can be cut out. And that's what Klein is saying, that there's a kind of virtuous circle here insofar as all these problems are interconnected through the social. And that's why she thinks, and I agree, that we can't solve it within the system that we have. And daunting as it seems, we have to figure out a way to get somewhere else pretty quickly.
I just have to jump in on a few of those points, just because the facts are important. Actually, in terms of the amount of land we use, raw materials, a number of other metrics actually have stabilized since the 70s. I think the 70s was actually the peak. And there was a recent article that had a lot of those numbers. It's not true for emissions and it's not true for energy, but a lot of that is driven by population growth. I mean, since 1970, we've nearly doubled the global population. So on a per capita basis, actually, I believe we're more efficient now for most metrics than we were in 1970. The other point I want to make is someone mentioned, whether if we just eliminated consumerism, we could we could limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees, and I think that's a silly notion. Maybe it's just a value judgment, but as a scientist, we can actually put numbers on that. What it would take to get to 2 degrees, and it's a daunting task. I believe personally it's possible, but I don't think I guess in the broadest sense, consumerism is at the root of it, but I'm not sure it's a useful way to frame the problem. I'd rather think of it as just 7.2 billion people on the planet pursuing their lives as creatively and industriously as they can, and that results in a finite amount of emissions. And to roll those emissions back, either you need to have less people, or you need to use less energy, or you need to make that energy with fewer emissions. Those are really the only choices. Now, whether you can think about that as people having fewer pairs of shoes, I don't know. 64 pieces of clothing per year? That's clearly not academics. Lucky if it was 6. But, I think sometimes there's sort of these urban myths that are perpetuated about environmental problems, and they oversimplify them to the point where I think they detract from some of the clarity we need to attack them.
What is the solution going to be then, David? Because, by mid-century, we're going to have a global population of 9 billion, probably. And furthermore, it's a good thing, increased urbanization. We've already, most of the time is now in cities by that time, maybe, 75%. Prosperity is going to be moving the way it's moving now through China, India, and Africa. People are going to have a better standard of life, which they well should because they really need it. And you're going to have increased consumption, too, side by side with increased populations. How's that going to work unless there is some sort of energy magic silver bullet that can solve?
Well, I don't have the magic sociological solution to this. As I said in my little speech, there's no silver bullet. And by the way, anyone who tells you they think they know what we should do, in my opinion, is not being sufficiently humble. This is a really daunting challenge. But there are some really clever ideas out there. I think it's hard for me to imagine solutions that don't embrace some kind of renewable energy. But to make that work, we have to make technological breakthroughs, for example, in storage. So, I'm a strong supporter of more R&D, both from public and private sector. There are some signs that we're actually making progress in terms of per capita CO2 reduction. For example, in the United States, we now emit less carbon per person. I think we're down to about 17 tons per person per year, and I think we almost got to 20 a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago. In my opinion, the President's programs have been very progressive on this front. I strongly support the diplomatic efforts the United States has made. For example, the recent agreement between China and the United States is an important step forward. But again, I'm not trying to sound like a Pollyanna. It's a very hard thing to do, and we're going to need as many creative solutions from especially young people as possible.
Man? It's hard to know what will work, but we know a lot of things that don't work, right? And so some of the things that don't work include, preaching. So I think that it's pretty clear that people are not going to change their behaviors because they're being preached to about what's right or wrong. And I think that there is a sort of strain of, in particular, American environmentalism that indulges in that sort of preachiness, and that doesn't work. We also know that science alone, although science is essential, it alone cannot solve our problems, right? We know we can make these kinds of statements, like we do things that we actually know. So the question to me becomes not so much how can we engage in social engineering to modify behaviors, or how can we, come up with a variety of silver bullets out there, but how can we structure political systems so that they're actually responsive to big problems as they occur. And this is a kind of a demoralizing topic because we all know where we're at right now, right? At least in this country. And so one of the things that has been most provocative to me about this series and that has caused